Hello, my name's Jason. I'm not an archaeologist, but I do play one on TV. So come join me as we go into the dust.
This show has been brought to you by the letter M.
All right, so we're over the hump. We're up to letter N, which is just over the halfway point through the alphabet. And N is for Neanderthal. Now, I bet you think you know a lot about Neanderthals, but let's see if I can prove you wrong. You see, for the longest time, the word Neanderthal was basically a slur meaning stupid, primitive, or backward.
I realize we old-timers, we grew up. If you called someone Neanderthal, that was an insult. Like, they're still evolving Neanderthal.
Comparing someone to a Neanderthal help convince them to change course and get on board with your public health message.
But thanks to archaeology, that stereotype is slowly changing. So let's start at the beginning. Who and what were the Neanderthals? Well, the Homo neanderthalensis are members of the hominid family, but we're not descended from them, us Homo sapiens. They're more like cousins of ours. In fact, we Homo sapiens actually lived side by side with the Neanderthals for a time and had some pretty intimate relationships with them, but more about that later.
Good morning, sunshine. Are you using my toothbrush?
So where did that ridiculous name Neanderthals come from? Well, the type specimen, and that's not the first ever found, but that's when a certain specimen of a species is whole enough and looked at by biologists who use it to define a new species and set out its defining characteristics. Well, that specimen for the Neanderthals was found in the Neander Valley in West Germany way back in the 1850s or 60s. So Neander Valley, hence Neanderthal. Now, a few inches shorter than modern humans, they're distinguished by their squatter, heavier build and those bulbous, prominent facial features. However, some of those silly-looking physical traits actually had evolutionary benefits that were adapted for the cold weather. You see that big wide nose? It could actually warm the air before it was breathed in. They also had specialized fat storage abilities as well, again, to guard against the cold weather.
You're not fat. You're big-boned.
That's what I said.
Now, the Neanderthals lived a long time ago. It's not exactly certain when they appeared. There's a lot of different estimates for that. But they went extinct about 40,000 years ago. Now, Homo sapiens, if you recall, they appeared between 300,000 and 200,000 years ago. So that's actually a lot of a long period of overlap. However, that overlap was effectively limited by geography. As we know, human beings came from Africa, but it took them a long time to spread out of the continent, and of course there was some back and forth movement as well. Well, the Neanderthals were concentrated in Europe, although their range seems to have spread all the way to the Far East in Central Asia to the Altai Mountains. And if that name sounds familiar to you, it should. If you remember, that was also the origin of the Scythian population that we discussed in a previous episode. Anyway, one of the things that archaeology has long since taught us is that the Neanderthals were not the stupid, primitive cavemen that they're often portrayed to be, or at least compared to human beings at that time, no more or less stupid than we were. In fact, fun fact, they had a bigger brain than we do.
Do you know the human head weighs 8 pounds?
So how can I prove that to you? Well, some of this that I'm about to tell you is a little controversial based on the dating information, but the Neanderthals had a lot of the things that we humans associate with culture and civilization. For example, they had art. This art ranges from carved bones, like that bear bone we discussed in the cave in Poland a few episodes back when we were talking about microwear analysis, or similarly this carved raven bone. They had music. Check out this bone flute made out of a bear bone, just like the one in Poland. Now, if you want to see this, you can find it at the National Museum of Slovenia, which I must say, for being in such a small capital city, Ljubljana, it has an amazing collection of prehistoric stuff, going back from this bone flute tens of thousands of years all the way up to the Iron Age and Roman times. They had technology, like their own style of lithic tools called Mousterian. Now, that name Mousterian comes out of a site called Le Moustier, where it was first identified. And just like with species, we use that term in archaeology when a type of something, maybe not is first found, but first really identified and characterized at a particular site. And then the type of artifact takes on the name of that site. Le Moustier is a cave in France, and maybe Spain have the heaviest concentration of Neanderthal. And incidentally, early humans had a different style of stone tools like those you see here. And when we see the changeover of that in the archaeological record, that's when we can identify the changeover in a site from Neanderthal to Homo sapien occupation. They made other useful tools. For example, the Neanderthals apparently wove plant fibers into rope, and that was discovered when we found a microscopic bit of that rope on a work stone flake. They also apparently collected, admired, and worked little bits of things that they considered precious, like seashells and fossils and quartz crystals. Not that different from modern humans. Think about, those curios cabinets in the early modern times, or even the funny little things we collect today, like refrigerator magnets. Now, some of these, the Neanderthals apparently wore as personal ornamentation, like, for example, these bird talons that were found in a site in Croatia called Krapina. That's a cave site where Neanderthals lived that I visited when I was there. So the museum was a little bit tacky, but it was informative, and it was definitely cool to see the cave site where the Neanderthals actually lived. Definitely worth a visit if you're in or around Zagreb in Croatia. Now, another thing we can see at Krapina and some other Neanderthal sites is a little bit less savory characteristic of our Neanderthal friends, and that's that they apparently engaged in cannibalism, which we can tell from these butchered bones that were remaining.
Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys!
Well, isn't that special?
Now, some of this might be ritualistic defleshing of corpses, and there's that archaeological BS word, ritualistic. But anyway, we do see, even in later human contexts, some cultures do sort of remove the flesh from corpses as part of funerary practices and do things with the bones. However, given the context and the amount of this stuff that we find, it is likely that the Neanderthals did engage in some, shall we say, indulgences of the flesh.
You're delicious.
I don't indulge in pleasures of the flesh.
However, when they weren't eating each other, they actually may have been healing and caring for each other. And this is going to be some really cool application of archaeological science. You see, in studying human remains, one of the things you can look at is dental calculus. Now, not the math. Calculus is another fancy word for like tartar or plaque on your teeth. Well, in analyzing some Neanderthal teeth and looking at very, very carefully at the plaque buildup, researchers actually identified some plants that have known medicinal qualities, but no nutritional benefits and are actually somewhat unpalatable to eat. For example, chamomile, with its variety of known medicinal and palliative properties.
I'm just sipping on chamomile.
It's even been argued that the widely dispersed skeletal evidence showing trauma and injury that had actually been healed is evidence that Neanderthals actually cared for the sick and helped them to get better, which is what enabled these individuals to survive. Now, this brings up another unfortunate fact of Neanderthal living, which is that the skeletons show a very high incidence of stress, trauma, injury, and illness. In fact, it seems like more than 80% of them died before the age of 40. And yes, in studying bones, we can actually get a pretty good estimate of the age at death, especially the better preserved skeletons. So yeah, it was a stressful life. But even with that stress, the early death, that little bit of cannibalism, That was not enough to scare early humans away, because we have multiple proof points, better I'd say even than videotape, of human to Neanderthal lovin', interbreeding.
Those dirty little messengers on me.
Well, that's me, Kay, you dirty little messenger.
First, we have bone and fossil samples of humans and Neanderthals which are intermingled at the same sites, particularly in the Middle East. We have intermingling of those different types of stone tools that I mentioned earlier. But the most damning evidence we have of all is, of course, the DNA evidence.
What's up? In the case of 9-month-old Cairo, Kwan, you are the father.
And we've learned quite a lot from studies of both modern and ancient DNA. For example, a lot of people, many people, have trace amounts of Neanderthal DNA. Not lots. I mean, the highest end of different estimates I've seen is about 8%. If we look at different populations of human beings, the least amount is generally found in sub-Saharan Africans who just have traces of a percentage point, and that probably didn't even come from Neanderthals directly, but instead from intermixing with other humans that had Neanderthal DNA. And oddly, the highest levels of Neanderthal DNA generally are found in East Asians. Now, why is that weird? Remember, the Neanderthals only made it to Central Asia. No traces of them have been found in East Asia. So that's probably just testament to the fact that humans migrated around a lot and this history of human beings is pretty complicated. However, remember, we're generally talking about small amounts, lower single digits. Now, that's the modern DNA. Of course, the ancient DNA has taught us quite a bit too. It seems like as of now, there's about 40 Neanderthal genomes that have been published. And oddly, over a dozen of those came from two sites in the Altai Mountains, those mountains, again, in the Mongolia-Russia area. And again, what's weird about that is that's the easternmost extremity of the Neanderthal sort of living range. What the study revealed, not surprisingly, is that a lot of the members of this small community were related. We had a father and a daughter, for example. Moreover, like most documented human societies, Neanderthals seem to have been patrilocal, meaning that it was the females, the women, that went to go live with the families and communities of their mates or husbands, although they probably didn't have the concept of marriage that we do. And now this part gets into one of the inherent weaknesses of the Neanderthals that probably was a huge factor contributing to their extinction. And that's that they had a very small population size and gene pool as a result. At any given time, there were only thousands or maybe low tens of thousands of them. Thus, they were not very genetically robust. They likely shared a lot of the same genetic vulnerabilities due to the limited gene pool. They lived in small, isolated communities of very sparsely populated, meaning that there was very likely a lot of, shall we say, close family relationships.
So if we have the same mother, tonight I'm gonna my brother.
And we know that's never good for the gene pool. Just ask the Habsburgs. So by the time modern humans came into contact with them, bad stuff was in store for the Neanderthals. Perhaps just like the Native Americans, they were vulnerable to disease, and there is some evidence of that. Maybe they were even killed in conflicts with humans, at least some of them were. Or perhaps they were just sort of bred out of existence in the face of better adapted Homo sapiens. In any event, it's probably a mix of all of these factors. So they seem to have made their last stand about 40,000 years ago in this area of northern Spain. Whatever the case may be, the fact is the Neanderthals do live on. They live on in us, in our DNA, even if it's only 1, 2, or 3% of it. So to summarize, if you've learned anything from this video, I hope it's that, number 1, the Neanderthals were not the primitive cavemen we often think them to be. In fact, they probably were not even really any less competent than Homo sapiens living at the same time, just less well adapted from an evolutionary standpoint. And number two, look at how powerful archaeology can be in reconstructing such ancient history. Look at all of the archaeological tools we've brought to bear. DNA analysis, skeletal analysis, dental analysis, lithics, isotopes, you name it, we've done it. And that, my friends, is the power of archaeology. Okay, so today we are going to visit Carnac.
Carnac, the Magnificent.
No, not that Carnac.
The colossal site of Carnac, Egypt is one of the largest temple complexes in the world.
No, not that one either. Although, come to think of it, I have been there too, and it's definitely worth doing a site visit there, but anyway, that's for another episode. Today, we're staying closer to home and visiting the alignments of Carnac in Brittany, and that's northwestern France. Now, what are these alignments anyway? Well, they're standing stones, kind of like Stonehenge, but not at all, actually. You see, Stonehenge is a circle, hence a henge. These are fields upon fields and rows upon rows of standing stones, most of which are oriented in the same direction, hence alignments. Now, there's a few different kinds of megalithic monuments there on site. I'm not going to get into that right now. You'll see that in the video. Now, you're probably thinking, Carnac, that doesn't sound very French, and you would be right, because Carnac is actually the anglicization, or in this case, francisation, as they'd say in French, of the Breton word Carnag. Now, Breton is a Celtic language, kind of like Welsh or Cornish or Scots Gaelic, and that would be the language that's indigenous to Brittany. Now, it's believed that that word Carnag kind of means like a cairn or a memorial marker in Old Celtic. But these things, these alignments, are actually much older than the Celts. Now, they were erected between the 3rd and the 5th millennia BC, so that's like 5,000 to 7,000 years ago. However, the site is complex. Being so old, its life covers the Neolithic, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, that would be when the Celts were around, the Roman times, the medieval times, and the modern times. So it's been through a lot. It's complicated. It's like an onion. There are layers.
Layers! Onions have layers. Ogres have layers. Onions have layers. You get it. We both have layers.
For example, one of my favorite characters from early medieval Britain, that fire and brimstone monk Gildas, he actually settled in the area after fleeing the Anglo-Saxon onslaught in Britain. He even founded a monastery nearby. And in fact, I was in town for a wedding, and the wedding ceremony took place in a church that was supposedly founded by Gildas, making it like 1,500 years old. Anyway, I digress because the origins of these alignments have nothing to do with any of that. We're talking about Gildas in the early medieval times. We're going to go back thousands of years before that to the Neolithic. Now, this video is just me kind of walking around the site riffing, talking about relevant and maybe sometimes not so relevant historical and archaeological issues. It's a bit rough and stream of consciousness, not my usual organized self, but hey, it was before I became kind of a big deal and a mega celebrity.
And I can't deny the fact that you like me. Right now, you like me.
So yeah, I hope it's tolerable for you. Something a little bit different for today's site visit. So I'm here in Carnac. In French, these are les alignements de Carnac. This is in Brittany, which is the northwestern tip of France that sort of sticks out into the Atlantic Ocean. Now, this is sort of, I hate to use a trope, but it's like the Stonehenge of France. Now, some similarities with Stonehenge, but very many differences. So, First of all, yes, these are big stones. They're megaliths. But that really just is a general term for megalith means a big stone. Mega is big, lith is stone. Now, beyond that, this is older than Stonehenge by and large. So Stonehenge was built between 3000 and 2000 BC. This may overlap with that a little bit. These are between 5000 and 3000 BC, roughly. However, you can already see some big differences. So here at Carnac, you have the standing stones all in alignment, almost creating pathways. And you have 3 different kinds of monuments here. So it's not only these are actually called menhirs, which are just solitary standing stones by themselves, but they can create patterns and pathways. So you have menhirs here. You have dolmens, which are the remains of stone chambers of tombs, so usually communal tombs. And so those are after the earth that's on top of them has kind of disappeared and worn away. You have some of those in the UK too, sure, but they have them here. And then they also have tumuli, which are the original tombs. They're dolmens, but with the earth over them. So here you have menhirs, tumuli, and dolmens. Now, as I said, this was older. These stones also are a little more local. Some of them came from right around here. Others, some kilometers away. I think maybe as far as 10 kilometers away. Of course, we know Stonehenge, some of that stone is fairly local, but some of it came all the way from Wales, so it was brought, from a further location. Now, even though this is earlier, it's still generally speaking the the Neolithic time. This is when communities really were making the transition from hunter-gatherer to becoming settled farming communities. And of course, we're not really sure what this means. I mean, there's still debate raging about what Stonehenge meant. It could be some kind of ancestor worship. It could be the general explanation is for this. It's sort of pathways guiding you into a certain sacred space or landscape. There's no way of ever knowing, but that's what archaeology does. It's to find evidence that will help you paint the picture for what all of this means. Now, some more modern observations. This is located in a charming village called Carnac, but it's a huge area. So we're going to, it takes about 2 hours to walk around this. So we're going to see little bits and pieces of it. But such a big change from the US and the UK. It's free to get in here. There's a €11 guided tour, which doesn't take you around too much, but it's an hour talk. I don't have time to do that now because I have to go to a wedding, but so I'm going to show myself around, but 2 hours free parking. And it's a very different attitude in a lot of Europe versus the US and the UK, which is geographically Europe, but no more politically, where heritage is seen as, a luxury. Here it's seen as part of who the people are and the nation. Now, of course, there's costs and benefits of some of that. I mean, one of the reasons the sites are very well kept up in the US and the UK is because they're so expensive to get into. That restricts the access. And here, of course, being free, everyone can go, which is wonderful. Right now, the state of preservation of the site that I'm seeing is good. There was a visitor center that had a video. I must say, the museum part of it, there really wasn't one. It was more of a gift shop. There is a museum in town, which I will check out, a prehistoric museum if I get a chance. And we have a beautiful day, which it wasn't supposed to be, so I'm happy about that. So here you can just see some more of those pathways, how they're kind of all in a row, leading in different directions. And this is just the first spot. We've got 2-hour walk ahead. So this first area is called Menek. It's actually, the whole village was built within the sort of stone field. I assume some of it's been taken down, that village. This has, I think, more than 1,000 stones. I think it's about 1,050, and it's almost 1 kilometer long, 950 meters. So that gives you a sense of the scale of this place. And this is only about 1/5 of the site. So it's going to be a long, full walk through all of this, but it's a beautiful walk, you can see. And once again, I have to emphasize it's free, which you won't find in most countries. And that says something about the French and their view of heritage. Of course, right now, some of that is, you could say, under attack or in doubt, because there are violent riots all over France at the moment. It's calmed down a little bit since last week. But, that raises questions. Who does this heritage speak to? The problems with newer populations here, do they feel part of this heritage? Does this heritage have a role to play in perhaps creating some sense of unity or shared culture, shared history? These kinds of standing stones, although this site is unique, being by far, I think, the largest landscape like this in Europe, this is not unique. You can find, I saw plenty of this, for example, in Portugal when I was there for a month during COVID. You can find these all over the Near East. So it is something that people share, but it's in its own way uniquely French. So it raises questions about heritage, but one thing we can say is the French take their heritage very seriously, and so visiting some of these sites, they want the people here to take it seriously as well as visitors. Just some frame of reference, I used to live in Paris. Now, I haven't been to Versailles, I haven't been to the Louvre in some years, but those are cheaper than, your average old country house visit in the UK or a plantation visit in South Carolina, where my mom has recently relocated. So it just gives you a sense. You can spend more money at one plantation site in South Carolina that you can to visit the Louvre or Versailles. And of course, this is free. Another thing to think about as we're walking here, and it just keeps going and going, is, of course, I'm seeing tourists here. So far, all domestic tourists, not foreign. But I see a lot of local people here just walking their dogs, going for a jog. And that's something else to think about, is heritage in visiting these places. There you may see in the distance someone biking through. Is this stuff just like for special occasions that you go to have your heritage hour or your outing on Saturday or Sunday when the weather's nice? Or is this something that's just part of your life? And is there value in that, walking through these spaces and just sort of imbibing them as part of your daily routine? And what sort of sentiments or feelings, if any, does that produce? Something to think about. It reminded me of in the U.S., if you go to, for example, the South Virginia, which is a state full of battlefields. For me, visiting those places, Yorktown, wherever, is that's a special experience. And yet, for people who live there, they'll just go walking their dog or jogging along some of these battle sites. These are battle sites where American history, the course of American history was decided, where lots of people died. So they're sacred sites in a sense. Of course, a place like this, we understand less about the meaning, but there's, of course, other sites like that in France. One of the things that happened here recently, it made some news. I don't know where this place is, but apparently some part of the site that hasn't been properly surveyed, so arguably part of the site, but maybe not firmly established, was recently destroyed to build a DIY shop. So notwithstanding what I just said about them taking these sites, very good care of them and taking them seriously here in France, even now that kind of stuff still happens. Of course, times like earlier in the 20th century, a lot of times historic buildings and sites were destroyed to build often horrible modern buildings that themselves didn't last very long. That was a big thing in the 60s and 70s. That was largely in the West and even some parts of Asia. Communism did something a little bit different. Of course, the Soviets and the Chinese destroyed a lot of their own heritage during the Cultural Revolution in China and the Bolshevik Revolution, destroying all the old religion and all the bad old stuff. but they then later on sort of enhanced those things and played them up to instill a lot of national pride. Communism, of course, is supposed to be international, but that didn't last very long, right? Even Stalin declared Russian communism to be superior to other forms of Soviet communism. So nationalism crept in, and then a lot of the heritage sites were talked up, funded very well, enhanced, and that's the key, they were enhanced. So a lot of the sites were altered. This isn't a communist country, but I think about some of the ancient sites in Iraq under Saddam Hussein that were kind of Disneyfied. But in any event, as good a job as France does, even here you had some destruction of the site very recently. That was a decision by a local mayor, I believe, and very controversial. So we can't expect perfection. Heritage is something that you need to be vigilant in protecting, even in the most conscientious of countries. The Mene field is continuing. It looks like maybe this part of the site is more damaged. The stones are there, but a lot of them are broken and weathered, so they're not that tall anymore. But you can see how far it continues, and I'm going to be walking along the whole way. Now, this is already the beginning of another field of menhirs called the Camario field, but I don't know that this is actually really different. Now, it's bisected, of course, by a modern road. Over there to the right of that house, there was an enclosure, some of which still, you see some remains of an enclosure and some isolated menhirs. So, but this is probably in ancient times just a continuation of the same landscape. So it's not really, it has a different name, but I don't know that it's really distinct. We have to think about who were the people who built these. The population, as far as we can tell, is not really distinct from the people who would have been in England and Britain at that time. And this part of France is called Brittany, and that sort of gives it away. For many, many years, a long time, the populations of Brittany and southern England, Britain, maybe even all of Britain were quite close, and there was trade and transport across the Channel. One of the very famous bodies found from this time, not far from Stonehenge, the Avebury Archer, I believe he came from the continent. I forget exactly where, but nowadays with modern methods, probably strontium or other isotope analysis of the skeleton, they can tell that he was not local based on the isotopes and elements in his, I guess it's teeth or maybe even skeleton. They could tell he came from the continent. Now, that kind of correspondence across the Channel lasted and was important long, long after. So I said this place is called Brittany. If you look at the signs, even the name Carnac, which I think in the local Breton language, which survives, just like Welsh survives, even Cornish is beginning to come back. These are all related languages, quote, Celtic languages. Anyway, if you look at the signs around here, even like the name Carnac, Carnag on the local signs, you can tell that that's not French. So what happened was people went back and forth between Brittany and Britain. And when the Roman Empire started collapsing and there was more disorder in this part of the world, especially in Britain, people started escaping that disorder and going towards the continent. But then when the Anglo-Saxons invaded, came, and there was trouble between the local British, quote-unquote, Celtic population and the Anglo-Saxons, of course we know who won. The Anglo-Saxons did. So the belief was that a lot of people escaped from Celtic Britain and settled here in Brittany. One of those was Gildas, who wrote one of the earliest accounts of the Anglo-Saxon conquest. It was a name of a book he wrote in Latin. I'm forgetting the name, something like On the Destruction of Britain or something like that, which was a polemic full of fire and brimstone, all about how that was God's punishment for the fall and the debauchery of the Britons. but he actually escaped here to Brittany, and he settled here and died here. There, somewhere around here, there is an abbey. I'll find it. Won't have time to go, but yes, he wound up here as well. So that correspondence between these two populations lasted until historic times, the Middle Ages. So we've come to a nice wooded part of the path, and yes, I did just look it up. So Gildas escaped early medieval Britain right after the fall of the Roman Empire, or the Anglo-Saxon conquest. He escaped to the Rhys Peninsula, which if you look at the spelling, Rhuys, looks very much like the Welsh name, right, Rhys, which we know like John Rhys Davies. So you can see the correspondence in the languages there, Breton, and because it's a Celtic language. Now, that was the fog of the early Middle Ages. What Gildas wrote, which I did check, was something like, yes, the conquest and fall of Britain. What he wrote, even though it's a polemic and full of all kinds of nonsense about angels and birds saving people and talking and whatever else, it is a source of historical record in that time where there was really almost no records there. In fact, it's believed he may have been contemporaneous with King Arthur, or the one or several characters who actually are an inspiration for King Arthur. Anyway, I don't want to digress because that's a whole other topic. But the point is, that's the early Middle Ages, which is this really dark period in terms of there being no information. He's one of the sole sources. That seems like forever ago, that he was born about 500 AD. That's forever ago. But if you think about it, that was 3,500 years after perhaps the last stone was laid around here. So that gives you a sense of how old the site is. Very, very old. So now we're in the heart of that, I guess is called Camario, the other part of the site, which is perhaps most visited because of the size of these menhirs. Now, I don't think it's been determined definitively how they erected these things. There's some good models, good theories, but it's very similar to the stuff. I'm not too into engineering, but, you know, with those rudimentary sort of pulley systems, rolling things on logs, if you've ever seen any of the simulations for how they might have moved the blocks on the pyramids or erected Stonehenge, it's the same kind of ideas. They dug holes for these things to stand in, and some of those, I don't know about here, but I know in the UK, some of those have been excavated, and with the organic material that is underneath those stones. Of course, if it's organic, you can date it. So then they have a sense, that's one of the ways they determine how old these things are. I'm assuming they've done that here. Now, the population, again, who built these things, the ancient Neolithic population, they are in no way related to the later Celtic, quote-unquote, Celtic population. This is some kind of installation here, I guess, on one of those sort of hokey experiential things. But anyway, they're not related to the quote-unquote Celtic population. I quote-unquote it because the Celtic population as such is known, sort of their heartland in Europe. The idea was they originally came from Central Asia. The steppe is in Hallstatt, Switzerland, southern Germany. The quote-unquote Celts of Britain and this area, Brittany, have their culture, so the language and a lot of the art motifs from the Latin, the twirly whirlies, but they actually have been determined as a genetically distinct population. So the Celts of Britain are not related to those on the continent by blood, by DNA, and likewise they're not related to these people who built this. The ancient population of Britain and Brittany, they really kind of don't leave much of a genetic trace, very, very little. Which is interesting. What happened to them? We don't know. Here's another spot you can get a great view of how these things are actually all aligned and how they make what some people believe is this processional pathway into this sacred landscape. As I mentioned, you can find these menhirs too in littoral Western Europe. I visited some of them in Portugal. Just nothing of this scale, really. But that says that population was probably related somehow, and we don't know their path. And it's interesting because I was sort of mixing some of the Neolithic stuff before with the Celtic stuff. It almost seems to be the same phenomenon. So these Neolithic people probably came somewhere from Central Asia, I believe, maybe via Anatolia, via Turkey. They set these things up, so they came from east to west. But I believe when some of this stuff was dated, so the old idea used to be all civilization came from the Near East, and it spread out to these barbarian lands. When these were dated, I believe they were older than some of the examples you have in Turkey and the Middle East, or Eastern Europe as well. So that kind of torpedoed that narrative that, people did come from the East. I think that's known, but that sort of the culture diffused from there. And cultural diffusion is sort of an old-fashioned archaeological idea, much maligned now. I'm not going to get it too into the debate, but the issue is that it's almost can be used in a racist kind of way, saying, okay, well, culture came from the Near East and then it sort of transplanted in Europe, and all sort of technologies and advances kind of diffused from there. It gets rid of the agency and the ability of individual people and cultures to really evolve. Cultures in different places develop different technologies and ideas on their own, independently of one another. But there also is cultural diffusion sometimes. So that's an idea that, in the righteous, what would we say, thrust to sort of deconstruct that idea, it I think went a little too far. But anyway, so in this sense, cultural diffusion, though, is not really, it's a little bit of a mystery because, yes, the people came from east to west, but these kinds of megalithic monuments seem to be older here than in other places. So who really knows? In any event, the story kind of replayed with the people we later call the Celts, because they also probably came somewhere from Central Asia. I think they also went to Anatolia and spread. However, as I mentioned, the Celts here probably were not from the original Celtic site that is known in, Switzerland and Germany. The genetic tests that had been done showed they were a distinct population. The Welsh, the Breton, the Scots, all of them, they're distinct. The Irish. I'm not sure if this is genetic or what evidence there is for this. I guess it's somewhat genetic, but that they came via the sea from Iberia, maybe originally from, who knows what originally came from Africa, but they came at some point from Anatolia throughout the Mediterranean up the West Atlantic coast, and then they wound up in Britain. So I think that's the latest thinking. But once again, it has nothing to do with these ancient monuments, which, again, that was a different population, but seems to have come the same way. It was almost history repeating itself. This is the remains, I think, of a dolmen. So this used to be, I think, an internal kind of tomb, and there you see it's even more. So it just keeps going. So the site keeps going and going. There was a thought in the, 18th and 19th century that this was all the remains of a temple, which, given the scale of it, seems ridiculous. But you could see what they were thinking, because these things are all in rows and it's very symmetric, that this was the remains of some temple. Imagine like Greek temple with the columns. Now, the latest thinking is that this is some kind of, again, a ceremonial ritual. That's a word in archaeology. When you can't explain anything, you just call it ritual. But a ritual landscape, which is supposed to represent moving from the worldly, profane space, potentially into the sacred space. So this is sort of the in-between zone that's guiding you there. I mean, it's all just speculation. That's what's fun about archaeology. But you can try to, what they did with Stonehenge is sort of the astronomical archaeology to see what part of the year these things align. Does it have to do with solstices and other astronomical things? And that might give a clue. This has to do with the passage of time and the calendar and the cycles of the year, which, of course, in the Neolithic, when people became grounded, and that's when they started farming, they were no longer hunter-gatherers. Those annual cycles became very important. So when the harvest would start, when the longest and shortest days of the year, the solstices were. That all became very important. So that may have a role to play in some of these, but I don't think here. Now we're coming up on a big stone over there, a big menhir. Something we do not want to associate this site with, nor any of the other megaliths like Stonehenge. I know it's a trope to compare, but that's one people know, is we don't want to associate these with Druids. Now, Druids were real people. They lived maybe from 6, 7, 800 BC up until the Roman times. Julius Caesar. Well, so firstly, the Druids, there's very little written information about them because they didn't write anything down on purpose. To become a Druid, you had to go and study somewhere for, I think it was like decades. And then, you learned their ways and you kept it and only transmitted it orally. Julius Caesar is one of our sources for the Druids, one of our only sources. So that was around the year, 0. I think he invaded Britain in 43 AD. So that's Roman. That's a Druid. That's 2,000 years ago. Again, maybe up until 2,500, 2,700 years ago. These megaliths were built between 5,000 and 3,000 BC, so thousands of years before the Druids. Stonehenge, remember, is a little bit not quite as old. Stonehenge was built between 2 and 3,000 BC, nothing to do with the Druids. We're closer to the Druids than they were to this site in terms of time, temporally. So Druids were real, but when you see those ceremonies of Druids at Stonehenge and stuff, that's a bunch of nonsense. I'm walking near to the end of the site. There's actually, like I said, it keeps going and going, but I only have time for this much if I'm going to go to the museum and make this wedding at 2:30. But anyway, you can see a modern farm right in the middle of this, these horses. And that's a little bit about what I was talking about earlier, how much this is just sort of built into the local community, what it means to them. It probably means something different than the visitors. But remember, the people here, even if they have very long roots in this region, they're not related to the people who built or who erected these monuments. So it's just a complexity of history. You can see, you might live around here, be proud of this, have a sense of belonging, but does it belong to you any more than anyone else? Is it universal? That's what the whole concept of UNESCO is supposed to be about, universal heritage. What do these things all mean? It's complicated. That was a horse behind me. And this is some of the last remaining menhirs to see. I think there is a dolmen here. Now, back a ways, maybe I'll show that spot again. There had been a burial that was very high status, at least for the time. There was lots of jade found there, and that has to come from the Alps, I think, which, nowadays that's a short flight, but it is 6,000, 7,000 years ago. That was a long way away. Most people didn't venture more than a few miles or kilometers away from their house, or if they had a house where they lived. So, this must have been a very high status, wealthy person. I think they found other stones from elsewhere, maybe in the Mediterranean, other places. That's a rather tall menhir there. But this is a person who was able to command a lot of wealth at that time. And I believe within that tumulus, it was a single burial. So that means all of the things that were buried with the person, I wouldn't assume it's a he, because there were high-status female burials in Neolithic and Bronze Age times. But anyway, that was a person who was able to command a lot of wealth. Given where we are, right by this Breton Peninsula jutting out into the Atlantic, maybe it's someone who had the ability to control or dominate a lot of land and sea trade routes. So this is about as far as I'm going to go. I walked through the trees a little bit. I've seen quite a lot. You could say I've gotten stoned this morning. I'm intoxicated by all the menhirs. Ha ha ha. Pun is the lowest form of humor. Oscar Wilde. Menhir itself is a Breton word, meaning something like long stone, I believe. Remember, Breton is a Celtic language, nothing to do with French. And that has its own tortured history. I mean, even my friend who I'm here for her wedding, I think her great-grandma didn't know Breton because the French had prevented it from being taught. And then maybe her grandma learned it, and then her mother didn't know. So it's a language like all over the UK, actually, with the Celtic languages that were forbidden their teaching. And they're making a comeback. Welsh has made a big comeback. Scots Gaelic is making a comeback. Of course, Gaelic, Irish Gaelic. But Cornish now, people are beginning to learn in Cornwall. There's a jogger, as I mentioned. Manx, the language of the Isle of Man. The last native speaker of that died, I think, in the 70s or 60s. They're beginning to teach that again. So these old cultures are making a comeback. Nothing to do with anything, but those are some foals, some young horses. I thought you'd find that cute. They all look different. There's 2 white ones, but other than that, there's dark brown, light brown, spotted. I don't know enough about genetics, but they look all to be the same age, so one mom, but many different colors. I'm walking along the road now because I kind of have to hurry a bit, but this is just a different view than I had before, and you can see the size of some of these things. The ones you're seeing in front of me, I know the perspective is a little off, but those are taller than I am significantly. There is a giant one, Le Géant, which is supposedly 6 meters, about 18, 19 feet high. I didn't quite make it to that one. It's just too far, and I have to make sure I'm on time, and I do want to see the museum. And that's the thing. If you really don't know what you're looking at, all of this stuff is just stones. It's learning about it, what it is, what it means, that is what makes it so impressive. And right now, this is one of those dolmens, so you'll see they're all in a row. So that used to be a chamber. It was covered by earth, and inside was a tomb long, long ago. This one is actually pretty well preserved, so I'm glad I walked this way, even though it isn't the most pleasant way by the road. You know, you look at that, it's 6,000 years old. I recently visited some enormous tombs like this in Ireland, and those were impressive because those actually did have, and do have to this day, an astronomical alignment where I think it's during the summer solstice in one of them, the light shines through this window like a peephole which was put in above the entrance. So even in that time they understood astronomy, and remember, that's the beginning of the Neolithic period, so the cycles of the year that started to have more importance for them.
Broadcasting live from somewhere underneath the ground. Archaeology News. The news you can trust.
Okay, as you may have noticed, I was away for most of the month of June. Part of that is because I was taking a course on human remains in the context of an early medieval cemetery, but more about that in the coming weeks. I also was busy churning out the first draft of my master's dissertation, which I can tell you is no joke. That is a lot of work. But the archaeology news waits for no one, and June was a particularly busy month. So let's dive right into it. Now, this is going to be a news edition of sequels, and hopefully I can do a better job of that than Hollywood has been doing lately. So stay tuned to see if any of your favorite archaeology news stories are involved. First up, the real Labyrinth. Now, if you remember way back from our episode on Knossos, that was thought to be the origin of the myth of the Minotaur and his labyrinth, the original labyrinth. Well, other than the David Bowie one. However, also from Crete, a new candidate has been found. This all starts with the new airport that is being built in the town of Castelli, just about 36 kilometers away from the capital of Crete, which is Heraklion. Now, Crete is becoming such a tourism powerhouse that it needed to expand its air capacity, and hence the new airport. And in the process of building this airport, the construction teams came across something that they did not expect. And actually, that's how most archaeology is done. Not as part of a research project, but just rescue archaeology. Something is found as a site is being developed. Now, what did they find? On Papora Hill, which is about 1,600 feet, 500 meters above sea level, the construction team came across a very strange circular building, and this thing was big, about 160 feet or 50 meters in diameter, and it had a very strange internal structure. You see, in the center was a round building within the round building that was about 50 feet in diameter or 15 meters. Now, this was divided into 4 quadrants, and then radiating out from this central building were walls that sort of resembled spokes in a wheel. Now, encompassing all of these were 8 concentric circles of walls, and these walls were really, really thick, 1.4 meters or 4.6 feet on average. So that's some solid construction. So we have this really bizarre, really complex floor plan. You might say maze-like.
How are you enjoying my labyrinths?
Yeah, well, that's what people are saying for clickbait, but the real story is probably a little bit more boring than that. Let's examine the archaeological evidence. First, the dating. As such a studied period in world history, Minoan Crete, Minoan Greece, has a very tight serration of pottery, like insanely detailed. So the pottery finds put this structure at about 2000 to 1700 BC, right at the beginning of urbanization and the construction of the palaces on Crete. And that also means it was in use for quite some time, a few hundred years. Now, apart from the pottery, there were a lot of animal bone finds and not much else. So no real signs of habitation.
Come to this planet looking for intelligent life. Oops, we made a mistake.
And given the high, prominent location, we know this could not have been the home of the Minotaur because, well, he lived underground, and we also would have found a lot of human bones because that's what he liked to eat. However, what did the Minoans like to put in high places? As we know, lots of devotional places, shrines. For example, there's this temple which has been interpreted, and we discussed this before, as the grisly scene of a human sacrifice that was interrupted by an earthquake which brought the temple down on top of the people inside, and therefore froze the whole scene in place for us to find. So the working hypothesis here is that this was the site of some kind of periodic feasting or ritual behavior. Now remember, you can take a drink every time you hear an archaeologist use the word ritual to explain something that they don't understand. Anyway, we'll wait to see what more comes out, because this is very much a developing story and ongoing project. But as for that airport, which is set to open up in 2027, it might face a few delays.
Son of a... Oh my God!
Now, this specific site was supposed to be used for a radar station, but Lina Mendoni, the Greek Minister of Culture, herself an archaeologist, did confirm that the site would be preserved and, well, they'll find another place for that radar. But this is just the nature of construction in a place like Greece or Italy. In fact, in the course of building this one airport, this is just one of 35 archaeological sites they've uncovered. And think about it, each one of those is a delay. But that is one of the joys of visiting a place like Athens or Rome, where you can see archaeological exhibits right in the metro stations. All right, so moving on to the next story. Ecocide on Rapa Nui? Well, if you remember way back to our episode about Easter Island, there was a theory called ecocide, and that was promoted by Jared Diamond. Essentially, what it said was that Rapa Nui was once home to many thousands of people who overexploited the land and through deforestation caused a lot of erosion, and that led to poor harvests. A lot of the people died. There were fights over resources. And that's why when the Europeans arrived, there were only a few thousand people discovered. Now, this idea has been controversial for some time, refuted by other evidence, for example, lack of a sign of warfare and violence on skeletons that were found, lack of signs of mass habitation. But now a new piece of research helps refute it. Now, this study, led by an American team, some of them from my old home state of New York, leveraged a lot of technology, specifically near-infrared and short-wave infrared satellite imagery and machine learning. Now, that's a lot of technology, which, as you probably know, is not my strong suit, so let me break it down for you. When you go to Easter Island, you definitely see some trees and greenery, but it's not exactly a lush place. It's heavily eroded, and it's just not really the kind of tropical paradise you might expect it to be. And as you walk around Easter Island, you see clusters of small rocks. Now, I didn't remark on this at the time, but it is in my pictures. Now, what are these rocks? It is argued that they are the remains of rock gardens. This was an adaptation for the unfavorable soil conditions of Rapa Nui, both the quality and the quantity of the soil. So when the Polynesian people, the Rapa Nui, arrived, they couldn't just import the farming methods from other more lush Polynesian islands, like terrace farming, for example. And hence, because the Rapa Nui people had to make do with this sort of rock gardening, the island never could have sustained a population of 8, 9, or 10,000, just a max of a few thousand that it had since achieved. So goes the argument. So what the team actually did was they visually surveyed the island, the site of some of these rock gardens, and they taught an AI model how to recognize them. Then they fed a bunch of the satellite imagery of the island into the model, and the model spit out some pretty surprising results.
Crazy.
If you look at that map, the yellow areas are the sites that the team visually surveyed. They went there and checked. The red is what the model identified as potential rock garden sites to a reasonable degree of certainty. So what does this all amount to? Actually, it's less than 1 square kilometer of land used for this rock gardening, this agriculture, which is less than 1/5 of even previously conservative estimates. And what are the implications of that? Well, essentially, it means the island never could have sustained a population of more than a couple thousand, which is exactly what the first Europeans to arrive found. That means no ecocide. Actually, it just represents a really good adaptation of the native people to some pretty challenging local environmental and climatic conditions. Now, the study isn't perfect. According to Rapa Nui expert and Professor Sue Hamilton, who is actually the former director of the Institute of Archaeology at UCL where I study, and a lovely person, there are some things that could be done to improve the study or get a higher level of confidence and corroboration. First, not all of the rock garden sites were captured, and they may not have been contemporaneous. So, in other words, if people were moving around or settlement sites were moving, they weren't necessarily all around at the same time. So what this would imply to rectify the situation is some more visual surveys and some test digs at some of these rock garden sites to try to get some dating information. Also, the people at these earlier times very well may have supplemented their diet with stuff other than what came out of these rock gardens, like fish. And that could be figured out through isotopic testing of human skeletal remains. However, this is a great example of a technological approach to an old question, and it did produce some pretty different results than what we've previously seen. But like so often in archaeology, it doesn't prove anything beyond a reasonable doubt, so let the debate continue. Okay, so for our final story, we're returning to the site of that famous Antikythera wreck, where in 1900 they found the ancient Greek Dial of Destiny. Well, as I mentioned in that episode, There's pretty much constant ongoing work at that site and on the objects found there, and the findings of that is what we're going to discuss today. So just in the last month, a team from the Swiss Archaeological School in Greece were investigating 2 sites just about 200 meters or 700 feet away from the original wreck. They were greatly aided in this by Hublot Explorations, that's related to the fancy Swiss watch brand, as well as the Greek Coast Guard's Undersea Mission Unit, which both help provide undersea drones to help monitor the dive and provide 3D imaging of the site. Of course, a lot of that imaging and mapping was done in the recent years, which is why now archaeologists can rely on some pretty detailed information about the area, and therefore choose sites with a great degree of knowledge, not just sort of trial and error as was done in the past archaeology. Anyway, the divers found loads of stuff. Around 300 artifacts or groups of artifacts. Now, among these were lots of pieces of marble statues, 18 statues to be exact. They, of course, also found loads of pottery, and with all this cargo, that leads us to the most exciting find, a whole other ship. The team found planking that amounted to a significant portion of the hull structure, so much so that the team was able to figure out a bit more about how it was built. And fun fact, opposite to how ships are built in the modern era, which is that you sort of construct the frame and then put the planking over it, this ship's exterior was constructed first, and then it was bolstered with an internal structure to reinforce it. So this raises the question, what is the relationship between this newly discovered ship and the original Antikythera wreck? You see, they both seem to have sank around the same time based on the pottery finds. There is no carbon dating yet or tree ring dating, as that takes some time. Remember, this was just found about a month ago. And given that the pottery dating matches up, an intriguing thought comes to mind. Was there some kind of altercation between these two ships? Remember, alongside the original wreck was a kind of a naval weapon used to sink ships called a dolphin.
Dolphin! Dolphin!
Now, the archaeologists originally said that dolphin had no role in sinking the original wreck. But honestly, as the hull was so fragmentary, I don't really know how they can be so sure of that. However, it could have just been a storm that sank both ships at the same time, or that they both just sank in the same era, but at different specific times. We don't know yet. The good news, as we've seen, this site has been a gold mine for archaeological info over the last 100 years. And as this specific project is set to run through 2025, and they will certainly be more in the following years, we may just know the answer to these questions in the next few years. Okay, so that was my first edition of Archaeology News after coming back, and it was all sequels. Go figure. Hey, if you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.